G'day everyone, it's Doctor Colin here with another video for your education and entertainment pleasure. Could have done that better. Anyway, today's topic is not to do with the paranormal, it's not to do with pop culture, and it's not to do with history. Today's topic is more, shall we say, biological in nature. We are in fact going to be talking about human sexual orientation. It's a topic that has been kind of escalating over the last few decades, and it's something that's really important to look at in the current climate, where we're seeing a lot of talk about homophobia and transphobia and all sorts of things. So what I want to do is this introduction, which will give you some of the terminology regarding orientation, and then in later videos I'll be exploring a few more issues to do with gender and sexual politics and all that sort of stuff, because they are really quite important in a global sense, not just in a Western sense. So, what I've done is I've put together a few illustrations that will essentially give you an understanding visually of what I'm describing, and hopefully we can get through this list relatively quickly and relatively accurately, so that you've got a basic understanding of where we're going from here. So, without further ado, let's get into the list. Heterosexuality. We're going to start off the list with the most common form of sexual orientation, which is also known as being straight. In short, it's the sexual attraction between a man and a woman. Normally this would be facilitating the union of a biological man and a biological woman for the purposes of procreation, but it can extend to trans people as well. Homosexuality. Homosexuality can be pretty cleanly divided into two different categories. The first is commonly referred to as being gay, and it's the sexual attraction between two men, to the exclusion of all others. On the other hand, you have lesbianism, which is the sexual attraction between two women, to the exclusion of all others. It manifests in much the same way as heterosexual attraction manifests in heterosexual people, but instead of a man being attracted to a woman and vice versa, they're attracted to the same sex. Bisexuality. Bisexuality is a bit of a tricky situation. People who are bisexual tend not to be firmly camped in one or the other preference when it comes to heterosexuality or homosexuality. They can be a primarily heterosexual person who leans towards homosexual attraction, or they could be someone who identifies as primarily homosexual who also feels an attraction to members of the opposite sex. As far as the nitty-gritty definitions go, bisexuality only refers to those that are biologically male or biologically female, not trans. Pansexuality. Pansexuals are effectively the same as bisexuals, but the demographic refers to people who not only are attracted to both typical genders, which is male and female, but are also attracted to people that are either androgynous or would identify as trans, so anything that doesn't fit into the gender binary. Demisexual. A person who identifies as demisexual is effectively saying that while they would engage in a sexual relationship with someone, they have to really be on a strong emotional connection with that person before they would even consider it. These people are typically very introverted, and it will take them a long time to get used to a situation with someone new. So to have someone who professes that they are demisexual is effectively tying their introversion to their sexual preference as well. Asexual. There are actually people out there whose sexual preference is to not have a sexual preference at all. These people identify as asexual because they actually, while still wanting to have deep and meaningful relationships with other people, don't have any inclination towards having any kind of sexual contact with people. They are more than happy to live out their entire days without any kind of sexual element to their life at all. Bi-curious. People who are bi-curious tend to occupy a bit of a grey area on the sexual spectrum. They typically will be someone who identifies as predominantly one sexual orientation, but is willing to dabble in the other. So for instance, it might be someone who is heterosexual predominantly, but who has entertained inclinations towards members of the same sex, or it could be someone who identifies as homosexual, who has entertained thoughts of dabbling with members of the opposite sex, but these people typically do not prescribe to a full bisexual lifestyle, preferring to stay to a predominant identity. Sexual. Someone that's attracted to those that fall outside of the gender binary, so those that are transgendered or intersex or even androgynous or gender fluid, is referred to as sexual. At this point we're going to look at a few things that are less to do with a specific orientation and more to do with sort of the paraphernalia associated with it. These things are typically more to do with gender than they are to do with sexual identity, but they are typically wrapped up very closely with a person's sexual preference. Androgeny. Androgeny is a very important part of what makes up gender, and it's very closely linked with the way that various sexuality is formed. Androgeny is essentially the bridge between what we consider to be masculine and what we consider to be feminine. Someone can be androgynous in a great number of ways. They could be someone that dresses in a way that is not typically male or female. They could be someone who affects vocal mannerisms that are typically considered to be masculine or feminine. Or they could be someone who generally perceives themselves to be somewhere between the two extremes. Another way that androgyny manifests is in what they call the butch and femme idea. Butch refers to someone who is biologically female, but will present themselves in a much more masculine way. This can be in the way that they walk and hold themselves, it could be in the way that they cut their hair, it could be in the way that they wear clothes that are typically rough and shapeless. On the other hand, you often have the femme. The femme is someone that is biologically male, but will present themselves with a much more feminine ideal. This could be in the case of someone who is male wearing makeup, growing their hair long, wearing shapely outfits, or even flowing gowns. Androgyny is a very progressive idea in that it tends to break down the barriers between what we consider to be the gender binary. And this androgyny is very important in the way that some people perceive their own sexual preference. One of the concepts that's very tightly connected to androgyny is gender fluidity. Whereas androgyny draws upon masculine and feminine energies to promote something in between, gender fluidity is something akin to an ever-changing spectrum of masculinity and femininity and androgyny. Someone who is gender fluid may feel more inclined towards masculinity at a particular time, and the way that they present themselves will reflect this. And then all of a sudden they may decide that they're feeling more feminine, so they'll endorse that side of them. Or they may feel somewhere in between, and that's the way they'll present themselves. Gender fluidity is quite unique in that it doesn't have the ability to conform to one or the other. It's something that's ever-changing. The next concept that's really important to grasp when we're relating to gender and how that impacts on sexuality is agender. So much like we have asexual people who don't have an inclination towards any sexual preference at all, agender people are people that don't prescribe to any gender notions. They don't prescribe to masculinity or femininity or androgyny or even gender fluid. They don't identify as anything related to gender at all. Extending from this notion is what's referred to as genderqueer. The impact of genderqueer on sexual preference remains to be seen, because genderqueer in itself is not particularly clear-cut. Genderqueer is a term that refers to something that is not masculine or feminine or androgynous or gender fluid or agender. but at the same time could be any one of those things. It's both nothing and everything at the same time. Genderqueer is a blanket term which refers to anything that steps outside of the accepted understanding of gender binary or even gender fluidity. Two areas where gender and sexuality overlap are gynephilia and androphilia, also known as gynasexuality and androsexuality. Gynasexuality is when someone is attracted to femininity, often hyperfemininity, where you would look at the shape of a body. If a body has prominent breasts and hips, if their features are delicate, if their nature is particularly nurturing or maternal, those are qualities that will attract an individual to that person, regardless of whether that person is biologically male or biologically female or intersex. Similarly, androsexuals are drawn to masculinity, strong musculature, dominant personalities, even things like body hair that are seen as masculine traits are draw cards, and they draw people into these relationships or desire for those relationships. Moving on from gender, there are other factors that are linked to sexual preference and gender that are really important to look at here. These are things that can really severely impact on a person's everyday life, not just their sex life. Perhaps the most important one to look at here is what's referred to as polyamory. Polyamory is when someone is in a relationship, but they have multiple sexual partners at the same time. For instance, you might have someone who's got a boyfriend or a girlfriend, but they also have a whole bunch of other people that they sleep with while they're predominantly involved in this one relationship. Polyamory is very similar in a lot of ways to polygamy, which is the practice of having multiple spouses at the same time. A relationship that involves polyamory is one that relies very strongly on trust, and unfortunately, where sex is involved, trust is sometimes a very difficult thing to maintain. Polyamory is not for everyone because the various human qualities that make us who we are get in the way. But because that informs the style of a relationship, we can see how someone's sexual practices and their sexual preferences can impact on the way they live their life, not just what they do behind closed doors. So as you can see, sexuality and gender is not straightforward, it's not clear-cut. There's so many different aspects to take into consideration. And this isn't even an exhaustive list. This is merely the most commonly used terms and the most commonly accepted definitions of those terms. Many of those terms may be different depending on the group that you're referring to, and some may have completely different views and ideas altogether. The point is that we need to start to understand what makes a person who they are and what the importance of gender and sexuality is in shaping that person's identity. If you enjoyed this video or if you found it helpful, please press like down below. If you'd like to see more videos like this and be notified of when I put new ones up, please press subscribe. If you have any suggestions for things that you would like me to cover in future videos, please leave a comment down below. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you here again.